It seemed that in a respectable suburb of a large Canadian metropolis, where clean, well-maintained streets exuded a sense of comfort, the White family should live in idyll and harmony. Neighbors had always seen Kian and Malik as the model of an ideal marriage. Friendly and tactful, they kept their doors open to friends, and their flower garden was impeccably maintained. In the evening, when the couple had a barbecue in the backyard or walked along the quiet streets, it seemed like they were in perfect harmony. People around them sincerely believed that this is what a perfect family should look like. However, the absence of noisy conflicts did not always indicate true unity between them. In fact, they kept most of the painful issues quiet. Open arguments were rare because it was unthinkable for Kiana to speak out loud about her most vulnerable issues. She strictly adhered to an unwritten rule: do not expose personal troubles to the public. She felt that disclosing her own family problems would be a disgrace. However, the hidden silence turned out to be much more dangerous than shouting, gradually saturating every corner of their home with muffled tension. The atelier Kiana ran was once her dream. She had opened it as soon as she married Malik, hoping to grow and expand. She even had a small boutique in mind. However, the reality turned out to be cruel. More and more customers were moving to large ateliers that lured them with crazy discounts and speed. Kiana's business was declining and approaching a critical point. Sometimes at home, she would cautiously approach her husband, asking for a little loan to move to a busier neighborhood or launch an advertising campaign. However, Malik, who worked as a lawyer in a well-known law firm, would calmly and somewhat arrogantly refuse. "Honey, there are so many expenses now. You can handle it yourself, right?" There was no direct reproach in his tone, but there was still a subtle coldness. These answers created an invisible barrier between them. In the evening, when he returned from work, he usually avoided any talk of everyday concerns. He used to hide behind urgent matters, meetings with clients or colleagues. In an effort to keep her cool, Kiana would meet him in the hallway with dinner prepared, but all she would hear was, "I've already eaten." They both seemed to avoid frankness, hiding behind a cautious silence. Amidst this constant silence, Kiana's anxiety grew. She could not remember the exact moment when she began to feel insecure and unwanted. Was it after their first anniversary, when Malik had given her flowers and praised her talent as a tailor, and then never mentioned it again? Or, perhaps, since she had mentioned a major client who had never paid for the work, and Malik had shaken his head and turned off the TV. Step by step, Kiana began to convince herself that the only thing she needed to do was to keep the peace in her family. She decided that if family arguments didn't come to the point of shouting, that was a sign of a happy marriage. One day, as she was concentrating on cutting fabric in her atelier, she found herself unable to concentrate on her work. She wondered if Malik's behavior was due to her inability to solve her financial problems. However, she still loved him, and was convinced that, despite the silent distance, he did not end the relationship because he still felt something. However, deep down she realized that some important foundation had cracked between them. That evening, Malik called, saying in a cold, almost official voice that he would be late for an urgent meeting. There was a particular sharpness to his tone, stronger than usual. When she hung up, she felt sorry for herself, even humiliated. It seemed that this short conversation was only the tip of a huge iceberg of their troubles, which would soon surface and destroy everything that seemed unshakable. A few years ago, everything looked different. As soon as Kiana remembered the first years of their marriage, she saw Malik as her ideal husband. He was attentive, used to give flowers for no reason, and could suddenly come to her atelier for lunch, admiring the way she created beauty from small scraps. The two of them dreamed of expanding, of buying a big house when their business took off, but these pleasant memories seemed too distant now. Of course, they had fought before, but it was mostly about little things like who would take out the trash or wash the dishes. However, as his career progressed, Malik began to withdraw more and more. He would only come home late at night, explaining that he had work meetings and assuring her that he was working for their common good. At first, she was happy about his success and preferred not to snap when something offended her because she did not want to appear ungrateful. "He's so ambitious, it's a good thing, right?" she convinced herself. Over time, she became more and more aware of the distance between them. He stopped initiating joint evenings, talking not about their plans, but only about his work. One night, Malik came home at 2 in the morning without even bothering to warn her and just went to bed, forgetting about any cuddling. Kiana lay next to him, unable to sleep until dawn, but never dared to say how much she was hurting. "It's not like we're fighting. Maybe everything is fine?" She tried to convince herself, but her heart felt that the difficulties went deeper. She realized that their marriage lacked warmth, but she was afraid to talk about it openly, hoping that the cool period would somehow pass. But over time, the temporary disagreements seemed to become part of their routine. She noticed that he no longer cared about the atelier, that he looked at her business with indifference, as if he didn't care whether it was working at all. Instead, he was interested in talking about some new clients, high-profile financial successes, and the amount of fees, which seemed to her like alien numbers without any feelings. Despite their emotional distance, they rarely argued openly. However, their silence did not have any real peace. Rather, it felt like they were each living in their own isolated world. Their friends, watching, called them a quiet, exemplary couple and thought that they were in real harmony. No one realized how often she sobbed at night when he was already asleep and she felt as if she were next to a complete stranger. Sometimes it happened that Malik, when he wanted to impress his neighbors or friends as a model husband, would take her by the hand and invite her to various events where Kiana was supposed to act as a beautiful wife. She willingly played this role, smiling and showing tenderness. People looked at her with admiration, saying, "What a perfect couple." But inside, she felt a deep alienation, as if they were putting on a play together. One day, during a gathering of friends, she noticed that Malik's eyes were resting too often on a young employee of his own company. At the time, she had no suspicions of adultery, but subconsciously she felt uneasy. He hardly looked her in the eye, exchanged a few joking phrases with the woman, and Kiana stood aside and tried not to give away her feelings. She wrote off what she was feeling as simple jealousy, thinking that it would pass with time. However, it would later turn out that this feeling was the first warning sign. On the way home that night, Malik told her that she only thought he was interested in a colleague and asked her not to make up problems out of nothing. She felt ashamed of her own suspicions, but deep down, for the first time, she began to wonder if he was sincere in his assurances of loyalty. She hugged him without answering, but the trust in her heart was no longer so firm. And subsequent events would confirm that her feeling was not in vain. Some time passed until an incident broke the usual silence in the White household. One quiet evening, Rosalind, Malik's mother, suddenly knocked on the door, holding a large bag of papers and wearing a tired, stern expression. When Kiana saw her mother-in-law, she was alarmed because her relationship with Rosalind had always been strained. Although she didn't say anything hurtful to her daughter-in-law, she acted as if she saw Kiana as just another one of her big sons. That night, sitting down at the kitchen table, Rosalind explained that she had come to discuss the new will. She had long been the head of the family business and had a substantial fortune that she intended to pass on when the time was right. Malik, of course, knew that he would be the main heir, but the details of the documents remained unknown until recently. With the papers spread out around her, Rosalind spoke to Malik, using legalese as if Kiana were not there. She talked a lot about protecting the family from accidental trouble, but at the same time the family meant only herself and her child. Kiana, standing aside, listened to these conversations in silence, feeling a growing sense of being a stranger in her own home. She felt a subtle lump of resentment in her throat, and at the same time she noticed that Malik, although he looked exhausted, was obviously enjoying the conversation. Finally, when Rosalind had finished, Kiana dared to ask gently, "You mentioned the will. Isn't there something I should know too?" In response, her mother-in-law looked at her with a slight ironic condescension that made the air freeze with tension. "Darling, this is a matter for the White family only. Don't worry, my son will handle it. You're not a lawyer, are you?" she said with another smile. Malik teased her that she had no reason to worry, that everything would be taken care of without her, and that she should focus on her studio. For the first time in a long time, Kiana felt anxiety building inside her. She had learned to take all the hidden jabs in silence, but now she was beginning to realize how limited her position in this family was. Rosalind made it clear that the final decisions had been made, and the daughter was not included in this plan. The words "daughter is not included" hurt her because she realized that she was not a full-fledged part of the White family, and therefore she could not count on anything. It was the evening after Rosalind had left, and the cold silence that had been growing more and more depressing in the house again. Kiana, sitting on the edge of the bed with her shoulders slumped, felt the need to speak up when Malik came into the room. "Don't you think I'm being left with nothing?" she asked quietly. "It hurts that your mother doesn't see me as a family member at all." He answered casually, "Rosalind is just worried about the business and the inheritance. Don't take it too personally." His voice sounded so distant that she realized he had no intention of taking her side. She wanted to ask him directly, "Do you see me as your partner, or just a convenient appendage?" But she kept silent, hiding her inner pain behind a cold composure. Her insides were boiling with indignation, while her exterior remained unmoved. Because of this silence, the tension in the house quietly but steadily increased. They rarely argued, but the sense of distance between them deepened every day. While everything seemed to be normal on the outside, Kiana's feeling inside was that she had no rights in this relationship. She endured steadfastly, cherishing the image of an ideal wife. It was these days that laid the groundwork for the accumulation of bitterness that would soon cause a disastrous explosion. A few weeks after Rosalind's arrival, the sky was overcast with gray clouds and Kiana's mood was equally gloomy. The studio had almost no clients, and she was hastily calculating whether she would have enough money to pay the rent. She desperately wanted to share her worries with someone, but her closest friends were immersed in their own affairs, and Malik seemed to live in a completely separate dimension. He was moving forward to the top of his career, while she was floundering in petty problems. One day, while cleaning the house, she came across Malik's phone, which he had left behind in a hurry. At first, she felt ashamed at the thought of checking his messages. She thought it was the wrong thing to do. However, something pushed her. If you feel that something is wrong, why not check it out? Overcoming her hesitation, she opened the menu. At first glance, everything looked quite businesslike. Correspondence with colleagues, court schedules, calls from clients. But suddenly she noticed a correspondence with a certain N, where she could see transparent hints of secret meetings, intimate jokes, and phrases that indicated that this was not friendly communication. Kiana looked at the screen with fear, realizing that this was most likely proof of his infidelity. There were even photos in the messages. Malik and the woman in the bar, both with friendly smiles, too close and relaxed for her to have any doubts. Her heart seemed to stop for a moment. She sat alone in an empty room, clutching her phone, humiliated and shocked. Now it turned out that the absence of conflict between her and Malik meant zero connection, rather than sincerity of feeling or mutual respect. All that she had attributed to being busy with work now seemed to her to be an over-reliance. She realized that their situation had been deteriorating for a long time, but she hadn't realized that things would go this far. In the evening, when Malik returned, Kiana kept her lips pursed and said nothing about what she had learned. She wanted to have a frank conversation, but something in her overcame her hysterical impulse, and she remained silent. When I cooked him dinner, I looked into his eyes and saw a stranger there. He, too, seemed wary. Whether from guesswork or fatigue, it is not known because he only asked, "Is everything okay?" And after hearing a short "yes," he sat down at his computer to check his work files. At night, lying in bed with her back to him, Kiana felt completely helpless. She wondered what she should do. File for divorce or pack up and leave? But she was financially dependent on him, as her atelier was not making enough money. Why should she leave, since he was cheating on her? She had once adored him, believed in their plans together, but now she saw that he was just taking advantage of his wife's presence. For the first time in her life, Kiana felt that she had reached a dead end. It was during these days that she came to the realization that their married life had long since lost the warmth they had both once cherished. Although she pretended that things could still be fixed, it was obvious. Malik seemed to be making no attempt to help her morally or financially. The atelier was in decline, and she worried that she would be left homeless if he divorced her or if she decided to leave. But he was obviously quite happy with the double game. As the shadow of hopelessness loomed, it settled deeper in her mind. She had no idea how much despair and hurt would affect her future actions. This was just the beginning of a more terrible outcome that lay ahead. It took some time for Kiana to get over her husband's infidelity and the disastrous state of her business, but she still tried to keep it together. Her unwillingness to fight meant that she kept her emotions deep inside. And then came the news that shook the White family. Malik's mother, Rosalind, died suddenly of a heart attack. It came as a surprise to everyone. Although Rosalind had a bossy personality, she also seemed strong and active. No one imagined that she would leave so suddenly. Her passing left behind a huge legacy and family business that was now to be taken over by her only son and heir, Malik. At first, Kiana felt sad and confused. She and Rosalind had a complicated relationship, but her mother-in-law's death still hit her hard. At the same time, she realized that the focus would now be on the will, the one that Rosalind had talked about in such detail. Soon, the truth became quite obvious. Virtually all the assets and family funds were in Malik's hands, which was confirmed by a notary. He became the rightful owner of everything his mother had built. It was then that Kiana realized how precarious her personal status was. If, until recently, she had hoped for at least some financial injections from her family, she now realized Malik has complete freedom to dispose of the inheritance at his own discretion, and no one will take her side. Of course, one might have assumed that her husband would have supported her if they had maintained a strong marital relationship, but after she learned of the betrayal, there was no reason to hope for his goodwill or the help of the atelier. Late one night, when Malik was loudly celebrating his new position and his inheritance with friends, she accidentally came across some documents in his office. While looking through them, she noticed a section that immediately aroused an eerie combination of fear and interest. A consultation on the procedure for transferring the inheritance in the event of Malik's death. It stated that if there were no direct heirs other than him, then everything would go to his wife. A thought pierced her. It means that if Malik is gone, she will get everything. At the same time, her chest tightened with shame at this idea, because wishing death on a man is the height of cynicism. And yet, in the most secret corner of her mind, a voice seemed to respond. He cheated on you, devalued you. You have no rights, and he lives as he pleases. A few days later, when Malik came home again at night with a slight aroma of alcohol and other people's perfume, she hinted that she knew about his affair. But he just waved it off ironically and said with a fake smile, "I told you that I have to stay up late to work." These cynical words cut her soul. Now Kiana realized that if he decided to divorce her, she would be left with nothing, since everything belonged to her husband. The next morning, she counted the losses of the atelier again, seeing how much she lacked the finances to keep it open. She didn't want to talk to Malik anymore. His reaction was predictable. That quiet voice in my head kept saying, "It's already clear that he's not going to give you money for nothing." The relationship had become so cold that she no longer wanted to reconcile. Resentment, anger, and disappointment were gnawing at her from the inside. Then she remembered again the condition of the inheritance. When Malik died, all the money would go to his wife. And at that moment her heart was filled with a strange combination of disgust at her own thoughts and an inner sense of determination. She hadn't yet uttered the words murder, but she knew she would like to get rid of him. The only question was how. They were not used to high-profile conflicts, so there was no reason to expect any kind of self-defense fight. The possibility of killing him with her own hands seemed unrealistic to her, but as she repeated the word accident in her mind, she thought that there are accidental accidents where there is no evidence of intentionality, and this idea for the poem stuck in her head. Before, she had only read articles about deliberately disabling car brakes and thought of it as a movie scene or something completely absurd. But now, in her imagination, she was seeing such scenarios more and more often. At first, she was frightened by her own thoughts. Could she really go so far as to take someone's life? However, Malik's repeated reproaches and the feeling that he could kick her out at any moment fueled her resentment. Almost imperceptibly, a determination was emerging, although she had not yet admitted it out loud, even to herself. Rosalind's sudden death, which had initially caused her bitterness, revealed another side. Without her mother, no one would control the inheritance, so everything depended on whether Malik himself would continue to exist. This unspoken thought was a nagging pain. The situation reached a paradox. With no other relatives, it was his wife who would receive all his property in the event of his death. And one sleepless night, Kiana was already painting a picture. A slippery highway, an out-of-control car, Malik driving without brakes. She didn't even cry then, but rather felt a heavy burden, as if her fate had already been decided. Later days seemed like a kind of numbness for her. In order not to arouse suspicion among her friends or neighbors, she maintained the appearance of normalcy. Communication with Malik was limited to short conversations, and he, obviously having his own hobbies on the side, did not want conflicts either. Sometimes, to reinforce the illusion, he would say something like, "You look beautiful today." She would only smile in response, but in her heart she continued to resist him. A few evenings before the planned events, she finally decided to think over the details. Malik mostly kept his car in a locked garage, and Kiana had access to it because she sometimes used it too. So, when he left home on foot and left the keys behind, she decided not to waste the opportunity. Entering the garage, she began to examine the car with her heart pounding. The thought of a police investigation and possible traces frightened her, but at the same time, "What if I succeed?" drove away her doubts. She remembered reading a story about cut brake hoses that leaked fluid, causing the brakes to fail at the most critical moment. She had no technical training, but relied on her own dexterity and a freak accident. With trembling hands, she removed a piece of the casing and tried to cut the hose. From time to time, she stopped, gasped for air, and looked around to see if anyone was watching. Panic was raging inside her. "What am I doing? This is murder." However, the memories of his affairs, her own helplessness, and the studio's debt situation drove her forward. "You must save yourself. There is no other way out." Finally, she completed this sinister task, and, as she closed the garage, she felt the same cold silence greet her in the house, only now it was joined by a heavy burden of guilt. The day came when Malik had to leave for another city, either to meet with another client or to meet his new passion. He quickly warned Kiana, packed his bags, and dropped a quick line that he would be back late at night. She mechanically wished him safe travels and then sat in the kitchen for a long time, staring into the void. She imagined the brakes suddenly failing on a highway and the car plunging into the abyss. She had contradictory feelings in her soul, both fear and relief. That night, the weather got worse. Heavy rain and then a sharp cold snap turned the asphalt into a solid ice rink, the perfect scenario for an accident. Around midnight, she started getting calls, and the voices on the phone were agitated. "Mrs. White, we're from the police. There's been an accident. Your husband." Kiana yelled back, "What do you mean? I don't understand," and was surprised at how convincing her desperation sounded. They said that the car had gone off the road, hit a fence and overturned, and that Malik had died instantly. She had to play the role of a grieving widow. She cried when the paramedics arrived, exclaiming loudly, "How could this happen?" all of which was witnessed by the neighborhood. However, a strange emptiness reigned inside her, and tears came only later, when she was alone. She didn't know whether she was crying because she realized what she had done, or because she was relieved, or because she was horrified by what had really happened. At first, everything developed as she had imagined. The police who examined the scene said the road was slippery, icy, and the driver lost control. Judging by the way the car skidded, the brake mark was not in question. But Detective Jerome Davis, an experienced investigator in such cases, decided to take his time. He was confused by the fact that the car was relatively new, the safety systems were in order, and the trajectory itself looked illogical. He began to gather more information. He talked to Malik's friend, who said that he had recently complained about his wife's strange detachment. It also turned out that Malik, having received a considerable inheritance, planned not to spend money on those who are not worthy. When the experts examined the car in more detail, one mechanic noticed suspicious scratches and minor damage in the area of the brake hoses. At first glance, it might have looked like natural wear and tear, but something about the details didn't add up. Detective Davis ordered an extensive examination, and the results only reinforced his assumption. The signs pointed to foul play. Although there was no direct evidence against the wife, suspicion was immediately cast on her. Their relationship was rather strange, and the motive could be an inheritance. Gradually, all the pieces of the puzzle fell into place. Kiana was summoned to testify. She appeared, wearing a black headscarf and an expression of deep sorrow. At first, she was quiet, talking about her strong love for Malik, mentioning his enormous workload and the risks associated with late-night travel. But Investigator Davis was interested in details about the inheritance and her situation. Her answers were confusing. When the subject of the relationship came up, she became confused, especially when Davis directly hinted at adultery and a possible motive. At first, she denied knowing anything, but eventually admitted that Malik did have a mistress. However, several inconsistencies in her words were enough for the investigator to realize that she was hiding something. Davis bluntly stated that the brakes, judging by the results of the examination, had been damaged deliberately. Her voice trembled, and her explanations became more and more contradictory. She said she hadn't touched the car at all, and then mentioned that she might have accidentally touched some parts. Eventually, a lump of pain and shame burst out of her. She admitted that she had ruined the brake system herself, seeing no other way out of a marriage where she was betrayed and humiliated and had no financial influence. Then all the circumstances were considered in court. Kiana appeared at the hearings looking exhausted, more like a depressed object of pressure than a cold-blooded criminal. However, the prosecutor had irrefutable evidence. Technical examination results of deliberate tampering with the brake system, contradictory testimonies, correspondence confirming her husband's possible misconduct, and her own words that she was left with nothing. Her friends and neighbors were amazed. As they had never seen open conflicts, they only saw a quiet couple. Eventually, the court found her guilty of premeditated murder. The lawyer tried to convince the jury that the act was in desperation, caused by psychological pressure, but the verdict remained unchanged. The crime was premeditated and planned. She was sentenced to 25 years in prison, with the first 15 years not eligible for parole. The room fell silent as the verdict was read out. She stood there as if petrified, realizing that she had gone from being an offended wife to a murderer and lost almost everything. The story, which seemed to be an example of a peaceful marriage without loud quarrels, turned into a real horror. In the suburbs of the Canadian city, people still tell how the White household was home to two reserved people who almost never quarreled openly. However, one cold night claimed the life of the husband and destroyed the future of the wife. Society is still debating whether Malik himself was a victim or whether he was also guilty of driving her to despair. However, the main fact remains unchanged. Murder remains murder, and guilt will always find punishment.